Wrongly drilled holes, loose rudder bolts, and a fuselage section that ejected during flight on a brand new aircraft, leaving terrified passengers exposed to a gaping hole in the cabin at 16,000 feet. These are just some of the quality issues that have plagued the aircraft manufacturer Boeing recently. Now, obviously, these impact our lives. Many of us listening here to Construction Genius travel quite a bit by aircraft. The good news is air travel is still the safest way to travel. But what this does highlight is how quality issues can impact a business in a tremendous way. And I'm very glad to welcome to Construction Genius today, Matthew Kleiman. And Matthew's background is interesting because he comes from the aviation industry into construction. And he has a pilot's license. He understands very much the importance of a rational, high-quality manufacturing approach. And he uses that background to work with contractors, helping them to drive quality in their projects. And that's what this discussion is all about here today. So using systems thinking, creating a culture where fear is eliminated and reporting quality issues is rewarded, and driving into an organization the importance of transparency. These are just some of the ways to help improve the quality of the projects that you build. We get a great definition from Matthew of systems thinking and a deep, insightful discussion in how to create that culture where fear is eliminated. So, as I always say, enjoy my conversation with Matthew. Feel free to share it with other people that you know would benefit from listening to this discussion. And thank you for listening to Construction Genius today. Let's dive right in. This is Eric Anderton, and you're listening to Construction Genius, a leadership masterclass. Thomas Edison said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. If you're a construction leader, you know all about the perspiration, and this show is all about the 1% inspiration that you can add to your hard work to help you to improve your leadership. Matt, welcome to Construction Genius.
Eric, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I, like many of my listeners, spend quite a few hours in airplanes. You have a background in aerospace, and we're recording this in January 2024. Boeing has been, unfortunately, in the headlines for a number of months. How concerned should we be?
So, as a society, I think aviation, aerospace is still absolutely the safest way to travel. And you saw that even with the accident in Alaska Airlines. There was what seems almost crazy as a piece of the airplane broke off, but these airplanes are built with such redundancy and so safe that nobody was hurt, thankfully, knock on wood, and the plane landed safely. So it is by far it's almost a miracle of modern technology how safe aircraft are. That being said, Boeing and its supply chain has a real issue that they need to fix, or else the public's confidence in the safety of aircraft will be shaken.
So when we talk about Boeing, we're talking about a manufacturing environment.
Yep.
And you have a lot of experience working in aviation. Tell us just a little bit about your background and the experiences that you have.
Sure. Well, I'm both a pilot, and before I got into the construction world, I was working for an aerospace company that built control systems for aircraft and spacecraft for many years. And after the Deepwater Horizon incident, that's the BP oil spill at the Gulf of Mexico in 2010, a bunch of energy companies started to look at aerospace companies like mine to bring in expertise around how you build reliable and safe systems in that operate with either hazardous chemicals or in difficult environments. And that's how I started to make my way into construction. Eventually was hired by one of our customers, which was Shell, to start a center for capital projects around how to bring in better safety, reliability, work quality into capital projects. And then 5 years ago, I left Shell to start my own company, Cumulus, to focus on the quality issue in construction and industrial maintenance full time.
Okay, so we want to get to the quality issue because
Yep.
I know it's something that's vital to every single person listening to this in terms of
Yep.
the projects that they're building. What are some of the things that you learned in your previous life that have been most helpful in your work with construction companies?
So the number one thing that I think I was able to bring over from aerospace was the concept of systems thinking, which is that every unit of an organization, and that could be a team, a project, a facility, has to be thought of as a system that is completely interconnected. And that's how aircraft are built to be so redundant, is that you have to, you depressurize the cabin, you think about every other impact that depressurization will have on every other component of that aircraft, and you design for that. And I found in the construction world, generally speaking, it's very siloed. And this is my piece of the project, and I will do my piece of it, and then it gets handed off to somebody else. That, as opposed to thinking about it as a construction project, as a system where there are all these interrelated components, and you could have butterfly effects of something happens all the way over here that has a downstream impact that you could avoid if you were thinking about it cohesively. And frankly, that's where, it's still early in the investigation into what happened with Boeing, but it seems like there was a system breakdown between their supplier and the work being done for Spirit Aerosystems, and then subsequent work that was done at a Boeing facility, and records were not transferred or accessible. This is, of course, early indications, early reports. And so somebody basically forgot to inspect the bolts holding this door plug in place because there was no record of it. The record didn't make it across. That's the most recent information that we have. And so the system broke down, and nobody, as far as we know, it was a communication breakdown, a system breakdown, and all of those redundancies that were put in place failed because of that. That's what it seems like today.
Okay, now it's very interesting. Give me just a one sentence definition of systems thinking then.
Systems thinking is looking at an organization of some sort and thinking about it as an interconnected network. Okay. So where every part of that organization is inextricably linked to every other part of the organization, and a change in one node of that network necessarily has cascading effects in every other node.
Okay. So describe that in terms of a construction project.
Yep. So the construction project, you could think about it linearly of what happens when you want to build a new building. You start in the planning phase. You acquire the real estate. You are the owner of that real estate. You hire a general contractor, hire an architect. They start building the design for the system for the building. Then you start building your schedule. You start estimating costs. Then once you have your design, you bid it out, and then you start bringing in the supply chain, multiple layers of contractors, fabricators for materials. Everything is coming together, eventually arrives on site, and then there are multiple contractors who have different specialties. Your mechanical contractors, your electrical contractors, your paving contractors, et cetera, and they all have to arrive at the same time. They all have to know what they're supposed to do, and the supervisors of that site have to understand what they're doing and have visibility. Where am I on my job site? And then eventually people get comfortable that the work is done, and you have the commissioning, turnover, startup process, depending on the type of building. So all of those people are all coming in to do their piece of it. And they're in their own universe. But a problem in one area, a problem in contract, for example, can have a very far-reaching downstream effect on what material arrives at site, what contractors expect they're supposed to do months or even years later when they arrive at site. And then somebody has to do through punch lists and other commissioning to validate that everything came together properly. And we have the expressions like, we did it right because we did it twice. That often happens. There's a massive rework problem in construction. I know you've talked about on your podcast before, the statistics generally around 30% of work has to be redone. That's what we see in the industry. You also see expressions like the last 10% of schedule take 50% of the time because everybody realizes, all these things weren't done. And so it just takes a lot longer at the end to fix everything, or maybe you don't have the right documentation or whatever it might be, and you have to go redo all of that.
So the tale you're telling, Matt, is a very familiar one.
Yep.
And I'm thinking about the listeners to the show here. So we have, a combination of general contractors and subcontractors who listen to Construction Genius.
Yep.
And the word that pops into my mind as you're describing this is this idea of control.
Yes.
And as a contractor, I only have so much control over this linear process that you're describing.
Yep.
So how is it that a contractor can assert as much control as possible in order to do things like improve the quality and the deliverability that they're responsible for?
The best way that I have found in my career, and this was both in the aerospace world, then when I moved over to construction world, is transparency in data and who's doing what and what they're supposed to do and whether it was done. That the contractor coming to a site has to have transparency into what the expectations are of them, what the plans are, what the designs are, what the procedures are, what the specifications are. That often is not the case. It's show up and then figure it out when you get there. So transparency into, and that's often what I find working with our own clients is that people, especially contractors, often assume transparency is bad. Oh, it's Big Brother. It's someone looking at them, and I try to work with them to say, no, it helps you and your business just as much as it helps the owner or the GC. That everybody's starting out with the same information on the same system, and the expectations are understood. And when there is a problem, that's clear to everyone, so you can work together to fix it.
So let me ask you this. Who is responsible for initiating transparency?
In my view, ultimately it comes up to the owner, that the owner has to set the expectation of transparency. We tend to see owners take a very hands-off approach. That's not always the case, of course, but it's very often the case. Ultimately, the GC is going to work with the owner to spec out the project, maybe their architect, the owner's rep, whoever it might be, and then everything cascades down from there. And so when we're working with companies, we try to start with the owner. If the owner is not setting that expectation, that often is not going to permeate throughout the project.
So isn't that where some of the conflict comes in? Because if you think of it from an incentive point of view,
yep.
And really what we're talking about here is innovation in construction,
yep.
And why a legacy industry like construction is so difficult to innovate in.
Yeah.
If I think about the incentives of the owner cares about one thing, let's say, and that's getting the building built the way that they want it as cheaply as possible.
Yep.
And so they don't have a natural incentive to go through the pain and agony of innovation. Am I right when I say that, do you think?
Absolutely. Well, they don't have they should have there should be an incentive because, but they don't believe they have the incentive. I would phrase it
Okay.
that way.
So then again, speaking to the contractors that are listening here,
Mhm.
how do I persuade an owner to adopt a more systems based way of thinking, let's say, with that transparency, when the owner perhaps has one project that they're building in their lifetime, or maybe two, and it's not something
Yep.
where they're coming back day after day again and again and again?
Yep. That's a great question, and it is a challenge because you have uh, the owner. The best way people learn is from experience, and if the owner doesn't have experience, as you're alluding
Yes.
to, it's once something goes wrong and someone goes through that process of something going wrong that they say, okay, we can do this a lot better. And how do you learn from other people's mistakes instead of your own mistakes? And I think it is very difficult for an individual contractor to come to a project. GCs might be different, but certainly a subcontractor to come to a project and try to influence the owner, especially when budget, contract, other decisions were made far in advance.
Right.
And a lot of that's locked in, and nobody wants to reopen the contracts to do something differently. So I think that, and that's where I think, and we participate in a lot of the industry organizations that try to work with owners to give them case studies, examples, bring in speakers, bring in people who've lived through this and say, learn from our mistakes, learn from where things went wrong. Don't let this happen to your project. You don't want to be the one who's months late or millions of dollars over budget at the end of the project because of something that could have been avoided, far earlier in the process. And that's the same thing that you're learning in the aerospace world is going to be going through in the wake of this Boeing example. Everybody's looking at their processes. How do we not wind up like the Boeing CEO, looking at culture and process? What can we learn from it so that we can make our systems better? That is one thing that the aviation industry is very good at doing, is learning from mistakes. And a lot of
Yes.
it because of uh, government regulators like the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, and just the amount of visibility that aircraft accidents have. But the aviation industry does learn from its mistakes, and that's how we have the safety record that we do today. Every single time there's an accident and people survive, it's because there was a lesson learned from an accident in the past, that an adjustment was made either to the technology, to the process, to the way of thinking that made it so that type of accident wouldn't happen again.
Okay, that's interesting. There's so much I want to ask you about here. You just said you just mentioned three changes that can be made
Yep.
to improve an outcome.
Yep.
Now, the outcome for any airline is ultimately safety.
Safe landing, getting passengers from one point to another safely. Yep.
Yep. We know that safety is tremendously important in construction, but for the purpose of our conversation here today, we want to focus on quality specifically.
Yes.
And you mentioned those three types of change there. There's the technology change, there's a process change, and there's a way of thinking change.
Yep.
What do you mean by the way of thinking?
The way of thinking can go back to what we were talking about before, which is thinking of the interconnects between all the players on my project and how I could align incentives. For instance, if I set up the contracts in a way that incentivizes transparency and cooperative behavior and win-win situations, then that's going to affect behavior down the line. If I, as the owner, am solely focused on driving down price and getting the lowest bidder to bid on my project, well, that's the old expression: you get what you pay for, and
Right.
that's gonna happen. So have owners think about it differently, not looking to jack up everybody's prices, but just incorporate in the contracting process and expectations and specifications that this type of transparency is going to be required.
Yeah, that's interesting. Going back to something that you were saying earlier, a lot of this play around change in construction, if it's going to be driven by the owner, has to be achieved through influence.
Yes.
And you were talking about your involvement in associations. What advice would you give to contractors in terms of how they position themselves to influence the industry in ways that are not necessarily impactful on today's project and today's issue?
Yep. A couple of things. It's a great question. One is openness to change. I think our industry, not to pick on contractors, but our industry generally is conservative and has a reputation, at least, and the reputation is earned to a degree, of being stuck in our ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to the leadership of, it takes two to tango, and the owner is going to, assuming they will do what they need to do to influence and make the contract set up properly for transparency. The contractor then has to be open to that, and a thought partner with the other players in the system of how can we do this better and not be immediately defensive. So that's one thing. It's you need openness on all sides of people who are willing to work together.
Yep.
The other thing is sharing data. Share bad experiences. That's another thing that we don't often like to do, is when something goes wrong, to talk about it and to talk about what we did better. And I spend a lot of time trying to convince either our clients or just other people I know in our industry, hey, come to this event and let's do a case study, not about how wonderful we are, but about how something went wrong, and this is the changes that we're making so it doesn't happen on our next project. So a general openness to new things, but also to talk about what went wrong is so important, so that other people learn from. Everybody has made mistakes. Everybody. There's nobody who's done a perfect project probably ever, but let's learn from it.
How do you analyze the root causes of the mistakes that occur?
Yeah, so when we are able to get data throughout work, so what we do and the data that we look at is we break down workflows on projects into their individual components. So oftentimes we think of workflows like a procurement workflow or something like that, but we look at workflows. What is a worker, supervisor, inspector supposed to do at the granular level? And
can you give me a quick example of what you're describing? Just give me a
let's
real.
Let's say tightening bolts, just because that's in the in the news, right? So let's think about it in a construction context. So you're building a piping system, whether it's maybe there's a chemical plant, a utility, some sort of utility. All of those pipes have thousands of bolted connections that have to be tightened. Sometimes they're welded, but very often they're bolted together and tightened. And there's often dozens, or depending on the size, there could be hundreds of workers all going out to tighten all of those bolts and assemble the piping. Well, in the ASME, American Society of Mechanical Engineering requirements, there is a process to follow on how do you properly tighten a flanged connection. And it's, depending on it, 5-6 steps that have to be followed. You have to look at the gasket, you have to look at the alignment, look at any corrosion. Well, very often we don't, those specifications are not set and not set as expectations, and they're not tracked. It's just, we're going to hire a bunch of pipe fitters who are going to go tighten the bolts. And you have to, but you need to collect data on, okay, you're supposed to do these 5 things, one of which is tightening bolts. Let's make sure you do these 5 things and understand that when we sign off and say, yes, this work was done, that there is a record for each of those work activities that work was actually done. And that is an area where contractors can be defensive, but we have saved dozens of people's jobs that we know about because something went wrong later and they wanted to blame the contractor. Hey, you did your job wrong. There was data to show, no, our workers did it. Look, they did these 5 steps. Here's the evidence. Here's the photographs, the real-time date stamps. And that causes the investigators of the incident to say, okay, well, we'll look somewhere else. Oh, there was a material issue. It was bad material. It was a counterfeit. It was a manufacturing mistake. And that's what we try to convince contractors, that this protects you too. And we have dozens of examples of literally saving people's jobs because we were able to show that they did their work properly. It's not just about finger pointing and finding out who did something wrong.
Hey, this is Eric. Just a quick break. And I'd like to share an insight with you. And it's this: you don't need advice as the owner of your construction company, you need confidence. And that's why the right executive coach is important. Their role is not to give you advice, it's to help you process through your options and provide you with a sounding board so you have confidence in the direction that you choose. And this is a lot of the work that I do with the owners and leaders of construction companies, is one-on-one executive coaching. If you would like to explore how I can help you as an executive coach, providing you that sounding board, feel free to reach out to me on my website, constructiongenius.com/contact. I'm not a fit for everyone, but for those people who I do have a connection with, I have a tremendous positive impact. And so if you need that sounding board, feel free to reach out to me on my website. And now let's get back to the interview with Matthew. So it's interesting because as you articulate this systems way of thinking, and I as a contractor have ownership over one particular cog
Yep.
in that machine, even
Yep.
if I don't have control over the other cogs, I can assert as much control as possible over my cog.
And create the paper trail that your cog was done properly. So, you're both using it, you're training your workers, you're supervising your workers as you normally do. But then you want that detailed record. Yes, we did it and we did it right. And here's the proof, because when something happens later, people are going to come looking, and the easiest people to come and blame are the workers, because typically there's no evidence. It's he said, she said. Somebody pencil whipped a paper form somewhere, and then it's just, well, the material arrived, and it must have been the workers did something wrong. And sometimes that happens. People are humans. People make mistakes. That happens. But very often it's not. And very often there was something that might have happened far back in the process and then by the time it arrived, nothing happened. I recently rewatched the movie Apollo 13 with my daughter.
Yeah.
And at the end of the movie Apollo 13, they talk about, well, what happened in the accident that caused the accident. And Tom Hanks's character says there was a defect in a part of the module that happened way back years before when it was manufactured, that when they did their cryo stir, it sparked and caused an explosion. Whereas everybody had been assuming that the astronauts, during the incident, they assumed the astronauts made a mistake. But they were able to show, no, there was a manufacturing defect by some subcontractor that worked its way through. And that was the root cause of the investigation. We often don't have that kind of data for construction, that kind of transparency and traceability. And that's what I've spent the last 10 years of my career trying to bring to the industry.
It's interesting because as you say that, I think about how, let's say the owner isn't driving that transparency. They're not really incentivized themselves. Perhaps the general contractor and their contracting partners can get together and say, hey, listen, guys,
Absolutely.
we want to build long-term partnerships with each other, regardless of the owner. And by creating this transparency, one of the things that we do is we protect ourselves from
Absolutely.
the the unintended consequences of any errors that may occur throughout
Yep.
the process of building a project.
Yep. And then also when mistakes happen, it's in everybody's interests, see it in real time and fix it before it hurts somebody. Then, fix the fact that someone didn't properly install the bolt before the plane is a plane full of passengers are in the air. And don't be afraid of that. And that's something we end up training workers a lot, is because in our system, they have to, in some ways we are able to automatically detect quality issues, but also we make it easy to report a quality issue. Hey, something didn't look right. And we do a lot of training with workers to say, it's in your interest to press this button that says report an issue, because that's going to protect you. Don't try to hide it or think you're going to be punished. And then we work with their management teams to make sure they're not punished for that they're actually rewarded and recognized for reporting an issue. Because that's counter to human nature often. It's counter to the culture in a lot of places. But no, it's report the issue. Hey, I got this material and it looks damaged. Let's report it. And that way you fix it then and there and not wait for something to go wrong later.
Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit more. How does the culture of an organization impact the ability to both spot problems and then solve quality issues over time?
Yeah, culture is so important, Eric. I mean, it's you hit on it. One, a lot of organizations run by a culture of fear, and we
Right.
see it a lot in construction, but many other industries too.
Of course.
It's if somebody makes a mistake, they are punished, and if somebody reports an issue that slows down the work, they are punished either directly or sometimes it's not officially punished, but they're hazed by other people on the project, and that's the number one thing. So you have to overcome that, and that comes right from the top of rewarding people who call out issues and making sure that that's a good thing. You of course have to balance that. You of course going to get people who misuse that, but so there's always a balance.
Yes.
But that is the number one thing. It's the culture of fear and the culture of not wanting to look bad that makes people, not only everybody makes mistakes, even the most expert worker is going to make mistakes. They're human. We all make mistakes so many times, but it's, do you learn from them and do you call them out as they're recognized so that they're not hidden? And that makes the biggest difference in my experience.
So it's interesting, right? Because as a leader, you might have safety issues, you might have quality issues, you might have productivity issues. But a lot of construction company owners don't necessarily immediately look in the mirror and say, I'm having this issue because of me.
Exactly. It comes right from the top. Think about, how did you react the last time something went wrong? Did you start screaming at people? Did you fire someone immediately without any sort of investigation into what actually happened? And you see that all too often. And think about, how did I react? How could I have reacted differently that would encourage people to behave differently the next time? And it becomes a matter of leadership, and it all goes, just like we talked about, the expectation for transparency has to go to the top, which is the owner. The culture is set at the top of whatever organization people are in.
And it's interesting because you described how, when we were talking about tightening the bolts, you may have a standard or a specification that's already articulated. But if you don't train on that specification and then hold people accountable for that specification, it has no impact.
It has no impact. It's in a binder or a PDF document somewhere that nobody ever looks at. And we see that very often because whoever the engineers are at the company, they spent a lot of time making this beautiful specification. And when it comes down to the field, you're right, they're not being trained on it in the first place. So it's not their fault because they're not being trained on it. And they're just said, well, I'll come out and show you how we've always done this. And then that's not being tracked. Now, what we have found, because we end up digitalizing those specifications and building them into workflows, but a reason that those specifications aren't used is because they were they're completely impractical. And they were written in some engineer's mind of, this is the perfect way just to keep on the example, to tighten a bolt. But this is, maybe it was using 20-year-old understanding of bolt technology, and the technology does change over time. and there's better ways we can be doing this stuff. So so again, it's a whole system. It's okay. The engineer made the specification. Someone's not using it. Maybe it's not the worker's fault. Maybe your specification is just bad, and you need to work on something that actually makes sense given current best practices.
Okay, so that's something. Let's dive into that a little bit. The first question I want to ask you is: we were talking about doing that case study on things that go wrong.
Yeah.
And people do this. We talk about it at least, where we're going to do a post job debrief.
Yep.
What are some ways to structure that process to make it as effective as possible?
Yep. So you can't just do that once. It can't be a one-time thing at the end of the project. What you need to do is, whether it's every day or every week, whatever cadence makes sense under the circumstances, we're always talking about doing a retrospective. What happened the day before? What happened the week before? What went wrong? And what could we do better? And those are usually small things. It's usually, we forgot this tool and then had to, stop work and go back and get the tool because we forgot it. So these little things. But that sets the culture and the expectation of talking about the big things. So it can't be a one-time end of the project. Let's go back, because if it's not part of the culture by that point, it's not going to be effective. So you want to have been doing all the small things. And it's the same thing we do with toolbox talks and safety, right? Before we start doing any work, does everybody have the right PPE? Does everybody understand the safety plan, have whatever permits they need? We've been very good at incorporating that into safety over time. Not perfect, but good. We don't do the same thing with quality. It's, yesterday was yesterday, and we're just going to keep moving along. But my team and I have been encouraging the companies we work with to do is, just like you have your safety talks, your safety briefings at the beginning of the day. The reason that those came about is because you talk about it all the time. It becomes normalized. Same thing with quality. What did we do what mistakes could we have caught? What mistakes could we have prevented? And talk about it all the time.
Okay. So I really like that analogy there, or not the analogy, the parallel between talking about quality as you would talk about safety, because everyone understands those safety talks. Let me ask you, how do you balance the tension between quality and productivity?
Yeah, great question, because there's the old expression that you could have things cheap, fast, and good, and you can pick two of the three, right?
Yeah.
You hear that in project management courses a lot. And while there's certainly some truth to that, I don't think, I think that gets exaggerated in people's mind, where they think it's a zero-sum game. That quality and productivity do not have to be zero-sum games. They don't have to be opposites. They could go together. So for a couple of reasons. One, while making sure you do the work properly, it may feel like you're slowing down a little bit to follow your process, follow your procedure, but there's a lot more productivity lost in rework at the end of the job than there is if it takes you a couple of minutes more to do whatever it is you're supposed to do because you're following whatever the process is. But even so, I think this is where the systems that provide transparency, and not only I'm not looking to pump our own products. There's others out there, but if you are able to track what happens during the course of people are doing their jobs just as they're supposed to do them, don't change how they're doing it at all. Just make sure they're being tracked and visible to everybody. Then you catch issues as they come up, and then you can fix them as they come up. And that saves a huge amount of time at the end of the project because you're not fixing things when it's too late. So that I think is the biggest lesson that we've seen is you can't think about the productivity just in terms of, well, this worker is going to spend 5 minutes versus 7 minutes doing this job. One, technology exists today that you don't have to sacrifice those 2 minutes, but you can bring the transparency to what they're doing, and you can set the culture so that people are talking about this all the time, so that they're catching mistakes as they happen, and you're going to save a huge amount of time at the end of the project in preventing rework.
So there's a real disciplined approach that needs to happen if we're going to improve quality over time.
Yes.
Um, what are some? What I'd like you to do is just give our audience a starting point.
Yep.
Okay, so we don't want doors flying off of planes in the middle of a flight,
Right.
right?
Right.
What's the starting point for me as a contractor to really begin to focus in on improving my quality?
I think the starting point, as Eric, you pointed out, is culture and looking at yourself in the mirror as the leader, whether you're a foreman, whether you're an executive at a contracting firm, the owner of the contracting firm, whatever you might be. How am I reacting when things go wrong? That's the biggest immediate impact someone could have, is to change the behavior for themselves and the
Mm,
people who report to them and work with them of, uh, we're going to eliminate a culture of fear.
mm,
Once you can do that, once you can say we're not going to be afraid of things anymore, then you put the systems in place to bring transparency to the process. But the first place to start is to really look at yourself in the mirror, as you said, Eric, and am I reacting to things, and how could I react to things in a way that makes it so that people are willing to speak up and talk about it and be open to improving, and and I think from a safety perspective, we mentioned the parallel. That's a journey the industry started decades ago and is
yes.
continuing on that journey. But let's talk about safety. This is important. We want people to be rewarded for calling out safety hazards on a job site and saying, hey, someone's not using proper PPE on the job site. That's called out and that's rewarded. And the answer you give when someone says, hey, you forgot to put on your safety goggles, is thank you, not getting mad at
Right.
that. Those kinds
Right.
of things. And then things tend to, once you're open and talking about it, then you could say, well, what systems could I put in place? What quality management software might I use to track this stuff? And it becomes a lot less scary to do it once the culture is not as scary.
Okay, so I like that. Eliminate the culture of fear and then use systems to enable transparency. Is that what I'm
Exactly.
hearing? Okay.
Exactly. Because and then talk to the contractors you work for, the other subcontractors you work with, and then ultimately the owners, and talk about the benefits as you start to see the benefits with your own teams.
This
And
is a
let them
long-term
realize
play,
it.
isn't it?
Absolutely, you're not going to
Yeah.
improve it overnight. I mean, I've been working at this just from my own little world for 10 years now, and it still feels like we're at the beginning. But people are recognizing the issue a lot more, and that's often the first step.
That's great. Tell us, Matt, a little bit more about your company, what you guys do, and how people can get in touch with you, please.
Yeah, so the company is called Cumulus Digital Systems, and what we do is we make it super easy to upload all of your work procedures into our system. It turns them into detailed workflows that workers and inspectors can use to track work in the field, just as I was talking about it, step by step, and have real-time visibility into what's going on, whether it's a 10-person project or we've worked on 2,000 worker projects before. And then we also connect to various types of Bluetooth devices. So pressure gauges, wrenches, things like that, where we can get real-time tool data just in the effort of having more transparency. And then you could find us online at Cumulus DS, so Cumulus Digital Systems, cumulusds.com. And I am very active on LinkedIn, and that's the best way for people to get in touch with me.
Excellent. So we'll put notes in the show, links in the show notes for both your LinkedIn profile and Cumulus. Um, before we leave, tell us, in your mind, who is the contractor that must contact you, that would get the biggest benefit from working with you?
The contractor that should contact us is somebody who has already started down the culture, the journey of being open to, okay, I recognize things can be better. I recognize there's a problem and things can be better. Maybe they made a mistake on a prior project. Maybe they know a competitor made a mistake, and hey, I don't want that to be me. And that's the best person to contact us is somebody who's had that thought go through their head. And then we can help not only on the technology side, but we also provide professional services and advising on the cultural change aspect and the process change aspect as well.
Excellent. Matt, I really appreciate you joining us and sharing your insights today on Construction Genius. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eric. This was a lot of fun.
Awesome. Hey, this is Eric. Thank you for listening to my interview with Matthew here today. Hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. Make sure that you're creating that culture of no fear and transparency, because that can have a tremendous impact on your quality. Feel free to connect with Matthew on LinkedIn. Go to his website, cumulusds.com. Links in the show notes. And hit him up. Let him know that you heard about him from Construction Genius. And one last request. Please give Construction Genius a rating or a review wherever you get your podcasts, so that the podcast can be seen throughout the internet. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you on the next episode.